Hello, this is David West again, your plebeian philosopher, and today we're going to be on our second part of our ARALAC series on the economy. This is part two of two. This is the conclusion, and we're going to talk about historical examples from the authoritarian right wing, the historical examples of from the authoritarian left wing, and historical examples from the centrists on different economic policies and different responses. Okay, so let's start with the authoritarian right wing. So the authoritarian right wing, once again, it's an abusive, unregulated, privately owned monopoly. So it's privately owned, it's abusive, and completely unregulated. And one of the worst examples of this type of a monopoly was racial slavery in America. I mean, racial slavery is truly economic tyranny. The freedom to own another person and, basically destroy them at will, buy and sell them and all that kind of stuff. Basically, authoritarian right-wing economies, they believe you can buy and sell anything. Okay, so in 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the country, 4 million. And the Civil War was initiated in 1861 by the South to try and preserve the institution of slavery. And that got about 500,000 Americans killed and many, many more wounded and maimed and mangled in that war. So that was the racial slavery was an authoritarian right-wing economic policy. And we could talk about the Industrial Revolution. Plenty of examples there. What happened was the Industrial Revolution created a lot of new, highly mechanized, industrial, right-wing, privately owned monopolies. And those monopolies, they hurt a lot of people. One notable example was the matchstick girls. So the matchstick girls, they were making matches with white phosphorus, and they were exposed on a regular basis to this white phosphorus, which it's highly poisonous, and it caused their faces to disintegrate. Their faces literally disintegrated, and they died from it. They were disfigured, and they died horribly in agonizing pain from white phosphorus poisoning. And mainly the Phossy jaw was because the main exposure to white phosphorus in the factories was by the mouth and through the nose, and it disintegrated all the bone tissue. They also had horrible working conditions and terrible pay. It was mostly women, so that's why they're called the matchstick girls. Another example of unregulated monopoly that abuses people is the use of formaldehyde as a food preservative. Formaldehyde was widely used in the meat packing industry and in the milk products, in the 1800s. And very high infant mortality rates. A lot of people died from formaldehyde poisoning, especially young children, infants. Those were the people who were affected most by the excessive formaldehyde in the meat and the milk. And of course, Upton Sinclair wrote the book The Jungle in 1906, talking about the Chicago meat packing plants, and he accurately described how the sausage was made, and it horrified the American public. All right, so those are some examples of right-wing economic tyranny. Let's talk about left-wing economic tyranny. We're going to talk about the Holodomor in Ukraine. That was initiated by Stalin. So Stalin, in his far-left authoritarian dictatorship, he tried to socialize all the private farms in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians resisted. They didn't want to have all of their livelihood stolen from them, and they were self-sufficient. They didn't want to be dependent on the government, so they resisted. And in response to their resistance, Stalin pretty much declared gathering food for public use was a crime punishable by death, and you could be executed simply for gathering food for yourself. He accused the Ukrainian farmers of hoarding food, and his troops would go house to house, just tearing into walls, cutting into couches, everything, looking for food stashes. And they could execute anyone who was found hoarding food. The Soviet regime exported about 4 million tons out of Ukraine. 4 million tons. Was it 4 million? It's 4 million tons. Yeah, 4 million tons. And around 4 million Ukrainians died of starvation in the Holodomor. There was widespread cannibalism. That's from, accounts from the survivors and from the Soviet troops. And the Holodomor was intentionally initiated by Stalin to break Ukrainian resistance. So this was an intentional act. Holodomor means murder by hunger. So that was an intentional act of terror from a far left authoritarian state. So let's talk about how centrist responses, how we can respond to these things. The right wing, the authoritarian right wing, is underregulated or unregulated. And the way you respond to that is you simply create regulations to protect people from tyranny. And that's what happened in a lot of cases. In many cases, that's what happened. So, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation outlawing slavery, and the Union forces eventually breaking the South, the Southern resistance, and doing away with racial slavery altogether. All those regulations, the 13th Amendment, that's a regulation against the tyranny of human slavery. And then we have the matchstick girls. Okay, so what they did is they unionized. They went on strike in 1888, and their union was successful. They managed to get better working conditions, better pay, and most importantly, they got a switch between. They got their businesses to regulations to outlaw the use of white phosphorus in matchsticks and use red phosphorus instead. Now, red phosphorus was much less toxic, but it was a little bit more expensive. And that's what the resistance was to these matchstick companies. They didn't want to pony up the extra cash because it would cut into their corporate profits. So they were willing to kill, maim, mangle their workers for the sake of profit. Pretty bad stuff. But regulation helped. The matchstick girl union, was a lot of work by the union members, but it was highly effective. President Theodore Roosevelt, he was very well familiar with the formaldehyde use in the meat, because while he was in Cuba, in the military, he tried to eat the potted meat. No one could stomach it. Like, if you tried to eat the potted meat that was poisoned with formaldehyde, you'd become violently ill. So he thought that the formaldehyde poisoning, the formaldehyde use in the potted meat was a disgrace to the United States and the military for essentially making this food, giving him food that was inedible. He was really upset about that. So in 1906, when Upton Sinclair's book came out, the time was right for some decent regulations. Congress and Theodore Roosevelt, they passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. And those regulations helped greatly improve the quality of the food and greatly reduce infant mortality and all the death that was occurring because of formaldehyde poisoning. And in the case of, let's talk about the authoritarian left. Let's talk about, like Stalin and Soviet Russia, what happened there. So when you're dealing with the authoritarian right, the unregulated authoritarian right, you got to increase regulations against tyranny. When you're dealing with the authoritarian left, you got to reduce regulations in the face of oppression, because oppression is over-regulation, complete and total regulation of all things. So what happened was Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to deregulate just a little bit. And what happened was that opened the floodgates. The Russian people had been under so much oppression for so many generations that the moment there was a little bit of deregulation, they're like, we want all of this gone. So the Berlin fell quickly afterwards. Mikhail Gorbachev it was so oppressive that just the smallest glimmer of liberty opened the floodgates, and the Russian people demanded all the liberties they've been denied for generations, and that caused the fall of the Soviet Union. So yeah, these authoritarian regimes are very unstable. They have a lot of political instability, and they're hard to, you know, get out of once you're in them without a collapse. So ultimately, reiterating, the centrist economy increases regulations in the face of right-wing authoritarian tyranny and decreases regulations in the face of left-wing authoritarian oppression. And if you like what you hear, then like and subscribe, and thank you for your time.